Hi everyone. In this video we're going to consider some concepts of external respiration, so basically what happens in terms of gas exchange at the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. So first let's consider atmospheric pressure, which is about 760 millimeters of mercury, and there are different units of measure that can be utilized to describe the atmospheric pressure, and so then the value would be different, but we're going to use millimeters of mercury for this particular example. And the gas composition of normal air is about 78% nitrogen, about 21% oxygen, and about 1% carbon dioxide and trace elements. So things like maybe some water vapor, some argon, some other sort of random gases. So we can describe the composition of gases in the atmosphere based on this idea of partial pressures. And partial pressures comes from Dalton's law. So Dalton's law is another law of physics or chemistry that states that each of the gases contributes to the total pressure in proportion to its relative abundance. So that means that, for example, if we have 21% oxygen, 21% of that 760 is going to be the partial pressure, or the pressure associated with one of the gases that makes up the total. And that's actually true for all the gases. So we could add them all up. We could say PO2 plus N2 plus CO2 plus whatever else is there is going to equal 760. And then here's our 760 times 0.21 equals about 159 millimeters of mercury. So that is the partial pressure of oxygen in the atmosphere. And we will write that as PO2 for the atmosphere. And so that's going to be inhaled. And so in sort of like the mouth and nose, we'll have initially inhalation of about 159 millimeters of mercury of oxygen. Immediately upon contacting the respiratory surfaces, we're going to have humidification of the oxygen, or of all the gases. And so basically there is water vapor that is produced and sort of inside of the respiratory passageways. And so this is actually going to cause a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen in the lungs, because now water vapor, which is in a gaseous form, is going to be one of the things that contributes to the total pressure. So if we add something else to the mixture, the amount contributed by the original components is going to go down a little bit. So we'll drop it to about 150 millimeters of mercury when we consider the humidification process. And so when we get to the alveoli, so maybe we're 150, maybe we're even a little bit lower than that. But at the alveoli, that's where we're going to start to see the oxygen transfer from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries. So we'll just draw a single alveolus, and then we'll just draw a single pulmonary capillary around it. And as we look at this drawing, what we want to consider is that as oxygen is drawn into the alveolus, there's going to be a high partial pressure of oxygen inside. And conversely, the blood is going to transfer oxygen all throughout the body so the oxygen can be used for cell respiration and production of ATP. So the pulmonary capillary is carrying a lot less oxygen, so it's going to have in comparison, a low partial pressure of oxygen. So what we know is that there's a pressure gradient that exists between the alveolus and the pulmonary capillary, right? So if there's a pressure gradient, then the gas naturally will want to eliminate the gradient. The other thing we have to consider, though, in this particular case, is that we have an air-water boundary. The alveolus contains air, and the pulmonary capillary contains water. And so it's a little bit different than moving just simply from one gas compartment to another gas compartment. The gas actually has to dissolve in the water in order for this to work. So now we'll consider Henry's law. Henry's law states that for a gas in contact with a liquid surface, the amount of gas that will go into solution is proportional to the partial pressure of that gas. And so in order to really explain this concept, let's consider a soda can. So a soda is a syrup plus, I don't know, maybe water, and then it contains carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide is what allows for carbonation. And so when the soda can is closed, we can see that there are carbon dioxide gas particles inside of the liquid portion of the soda, and then there are also going to be some gas particles that are sitting above the soda because the soda does not fill exactly to the top of the can. And so the higher the partial pressure of CO2, particularly in the air, the better the chances that the CO2 will dissolve into the water. the basic idea behind that is that the more CO2 molecules there are, because of the higher partial pressure, the more gas collisions there will be, and so the better the chance it will just sort of bounce into the water. And then if we consider opening the soda can, we know that now immediately there's an escape route for these carbon dioxide molecules. They're going to leave through the open container. So the partial pressure above the water is going to go down dramatically. And so because of that, the carbon dioxide molecules will start to diffuse out of solution. And this is exactly why soda goes flat if you leave it in open air for a long time, because we no longer have a high partial pressure above the liquid. There's no longer an incentive for those carbon dioxide molecules to stay in the water component. So this is a significant portion of the explanation for why the gas is going to diffuse into the pulmonary capillary. Because the partial pressure is so much higher, there's incentive for those gas molecules to move. But if the partial pressure of oxygen were to go down, even if there was still a gradient, it will be a little bit harder for those gas molecules to transfer. The other factor that needs to be considered sort of in conjunction with Henry's law is gas solubility. So it happens that carbon dioxide has very high solubility in water, and really in plasma, but the oxygen has actually a relatively low solubility. So what we notice is that as soon as the oxygen is transferred into the pulmonary capillary, it's collected by red blood cells and bound to hemoglobin, and so that's going to help the oxygen transfer a little bit better. So now let's take into consideration all those factors. So we could say maybe the PO2 of the oxygen in the alveoli is like 150, and maybe it's a little lower, like we said. And from the pulmonary capillary, maybe we're at 40. And so we have a gradient. The oxygen is going to move down the gradient into the plasma. And then as the blood carrying the oxygen is leaving the pulmonary capillary, we're going to see that it increases. Maybe we'll say to like 100. So it definitely increases significantly from the low that it was when it arrived. Now, the other thing we have to consider is that carbon dioxide is also being transferred at the same place, but the gradient is reversed. So in the alveolus, the partial pressure of CO2 is low, and the partial pressure in the pulmonary capillary should be high because the pulmonary capillary is carrying carbon dioxide that's been collected from all the cells that have been producing it based on metabolic activity. So the pulmonary capillary carries the CO2 to the alveolus, and then the CO2 will also move down its gradient. And in this case, it's easier for the CO2 to leave, even though it has better solubility in the plasma. It's moving into air. So as long as there's not a lot of CO2 in the lungs already, the CO2 will move easily. If the CO2 was high, for example, if the patient was not breathing for several minutes, this exchange might be impaired. As the blood leaves the pulmonary capillary, as far as CO2 is concerned, the CO2 will drop and it'll be to about 40 millimeters of mercury. So there's less of a difference in terms of the exchange, but I think it's easiest and important to consider oxygen movement and carbon dioxide movement sort of independently. The reasons for problems associated with oxygen are often very different from the reasons associated with problems with CO2. So there could be a little bit of overlap, but for the most part, I think it's best if we just consider them independently. Okay, so that concludes our overview of gas exchange between the lungs and the pulmonary circulation. And next, we'll think about oxygen transport in the blood and oxygen carbon dioxide exchange in peripheral tissues. All right, that's all for now. Thanks for watching.